Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Housekeepers Podcast. Dare I say the cleanest hour in podcasting. I always say that I'm very excited. Every time I get on here, I'm like, I'm so excited to introduce or to have you meet. And today I'm truthfully excited. I mean, this guy, we had to pull him physically away from the palm trees that are in upstate New York. No, there are no. Fresh off of PST, the PST. I want to say D disorder, I guess. PSD.
PTSD.
Pete. Good Lord. Thank you, Bob. That's what I need you here for.
I have it, so I should know.
That's right. PTSD of being a long-term care administrator forever and recently retired, Mr. Bob Jones. Thank you so much for agreeing to come on the show with me. We've been good friends for a long time.
Glad to be here.
I'm happy I'm really excited to have you on because what I really would love to talk to you about, I want to get into everything, but what I really want to talk to you about is why you hired me, right? Like we've been doing business together for a long time. Why'd you use contract service? Why you were solo, like you didn't use contract services forever, a lot longer than you ever did.
Yep.
So I'm curious as we get into this, I'm curious as to the pros and cons of using commercial cleaning services or dietary services or rehab services, just why contract out or why you shouldn't contract out.
Yeah.
Because I think there's pros and cons to both. Yeah.
Sure. I had 40 years in hospitals and nursing homes. So hospital side, in-house management. When I came to Wesley Gardens 23 years ago, they were just off of a service master contract. So they had gone the contracting route for a period of time. For 19 or so years, we were in-house until this, Ralph Peterson guy showed up at my door and said, I think this former company can help you out. But,
no, that's great.
And it caught me at a good time because we were, our executive team, our management was getting smaller. We were becoming leaner, but more irons in the fire with managing individual departments and trying to oversee individual departments. And, quite honestly, you don't always get the best manager in a housekeeping supervisor position. People can move up internally or come in from the outside, but they don't necessarily have the full background that you're looking for.
You know what I just heard was this idea that Harvard doesn't create geniuses. Harvard recruits geniuses. So you already to get into Harvard, you have to have a very high IQ. But when you get there, they don't add to your IQ. You don't go to Harvard and come out smarter.
I could agree with that. Yep.
It's very interesting to me because I think that is often the struggle we have in any management position, any recruiting for any management position, because we hire them as somebody who either already has management experience and we leave them there. Like we spend we give no forethought to how to keep making them a better manager, or worse than that, we promote internally our super worker and expect that that's enough. And so to your point that it's always a struggle in these departments, so not just the cleaning, housekeeping departments, but also in dietary departments. A lot of departments are like that, where you're even CNAs getting into a leadership position or a LPN getting into a leadership position, It's the same thing.
And those super managers go on to other organizations and they're growing their career. So you end up with turnover in some of the stellar performers as well. They don't necessarily stay. Despite you think you pay equitably and, that type of thing, the grass is always greener.
Yeah. What's unfortunate about that, Bob, is sometimes the grass really is greener, taller.
Agreed.
Tastier, a better side of the mountain, whatever.
Yeah.
Hey, let's go back all the way back to the beginning. You didn't grow up. You're in Rochester or upstate New York. You're not actually in Rochester, but you didn't grow up there. Didn't you grow up in Pennsylvania?
Yes, I grew up in Pittsburgh, north of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, um, until I was in ninth grade and was transplanted with a job that my father took in Rochester.
Yeah, but
So
wasn't there like a? Didn't you guys tell the story? Because didn't you go on vacation? Wasn't there a family vacation?
oh, we went on a 2 week vacation to well through a northern route, Yellowstone down to Grand Canyon, back visiting some friends along the way,
Is
family
this the
friends.
summer? Is this the summer between eighth and ninth grade for you? So is this like you're 14, 15 years old?
Yes,
Okay.
and when this was pre cell phone, so we arrived back in Pittsburgh and found out that the place my father worked had burned to the ground. Literally twisted steel, the tools. Was a cabinet maker, carpenter. Tools that he had gone up in flames and were charred as well. And he had worked in Rochester previously and said, "We're moving." And my mother said, "I don't know," because all of our relatives were there. My father said, "We're moving." And he, called Rochester, called the company in Rochester. They said, "Come on down." And so he was there, and he had basically a standing offer waiting for him in Rochester whenever, because he had worked periodically in Rochester previously, and the company wanted him to come. And as soon as he said, "We're coming," they said, "Great."
Excuse me, how big is your family? How many brothers? Do you have
I have two brothers.
two brothers? And
Yeah.
was your mom a stay-at-home mom?
No, she worked.
What did she do?
So she was worked at a bank at the time.
So she had to
Uh,
move too. She had to like take new jobs and
yes. So she, you know, we stayed. I forget what the dragging feet routine. We tease her about that because she couldn't leave the organization in a abruptly. So we stayed until it was a good transition for them. And I think it took a while for my mother to get used to the idea of moving and buying a house. And we moved into a house up here that we had never, that the children had never seen, because my mother came up to Rochester. My parents went house shopping, and he put a for sale sign in the house in Pennsylvania, for sale by owner, and away it went. And
what's so great about this story, and I've heard it before, it's why I absolutely love it, is the same thing happened to me where I was maybe 12 or 13 and my parents announced we're moving to Vermont, and I didn't even know where that was. I was like, what state is that in?
yeah. And anytime you tell someone in Pennsylvania, if you're either from New York or you're going to New York, they think of New York City, and that was the last thing we wanted. We lived on a dead end street. The front yard was woods, and we were riding trail bikes and everything else, and carrying hatchets and meat cleavers and everything else. Any tool at our disposal.
So funny. And so you get to Rochester area anyway.
Yeah.
And what did you do? Like, did you go to work? Did you work part-time as a kid? Did you?
Oh, I worked early on. I did all sorts of things. Bales of hay and picked turnips and potatoes and you name it. Then worked at a hardware store became assistant manager in my part time. While I was going to school, and then into college, similar type occupations. And
What did you
uh,
go to school for? What was your
oh, that could take the rest of the hour.
Oh, here we go. Did you keep
Uh,
changing majors?
I'll make it quick. I actually went to the local Monroe Community College as a biomedical technician, is what I entered as. And
Biomedical.
so I worked on medical electronics,
Oh, okay.
ventilators, defibs, all the way up to CT machines. I had appendicitis in my second semester. I was hospitalized for a week. So I ended up having that semester bomb, and I tried to get back, but it was just too much, you know, with the burst appendix and everything else. I not to get too gory, but I left the hospital with a tube in me.
Yeah.
It was, um, but I ended up going to MCC for 3 years, so I had a degree in biomedical technology and a degree in instrumentation technology, so I could go into industrial instrumentation or medical electronics, and went to medical electronics, and that's how I got into um, the hospital side first.
Interesting.
Um, went Sorry about that. Went to industry. I worked for Xerox for 9 months in a contract position, and after I was a year at St. Mary's Hospital here in Rochester, and the grass was greener because I was going to work for Xerox in 1981, and I was in 9 months, and I hated every minute of the day that I worked there. Sorry, Xerox.
I'm
I
sure it's not them as a company, maybe just your district, your region, your manager, whoever, right?
it was an R&D position, so I was kind of doing my own thing on the research and development side, but it wasn't the feeling that I had working in a hospital. The people you repaired equipment for, the nurses, the doctors, um, you saw what you accomplished at the end of the day. At Xerox, you worked on a widget that may come out in a copier um, 3 or 5 years from now, or be pulled and never see the light of day. So you had no real job satisfaction at the end of the day, or even what your long term goal might be, because you work on something and then that whole line gets pulled. And unfortunately, I found out after the fact Xerox had a history of doing that at that time. So you were,
It kind of sounds like what R&D is, right? You
yeah,
research, you develop, you make sure it works. It doesn't work, all right, you're out
yeah,
the door it goes, and
yeah. I've,
you got to
I've
have no emotional connection.
met some brilliant people. Gentleman I worked for had 9 or more patents.
Oh wow.
It was, but then again, I had better, here in Rochester, they did most of their electronics out in California at the time. I had better equipment at MCC than I did at Xerox when I worked there,
Oh wow.
which kind of is interesting. You're falling back 10 or 20 years on the electronics, your test equipment side. They just didn't come up to speed as quickly here in Rochester with their electronics side.
And
So,
that's why you decided to move full time to the hospital, right? Just to
yes, I
yeah.
took what I'd consider a massive pay cut at the time, probably 25% from the contract position
Wow.
to back to the hospital, but felt that was Newark Wayne here locally. Oh,
Pardon me.
bless you.
Thank you.
Uh, um, and I was at Newark for 9 years, so I started biomedical department there, and grew into the facility side. So that's where my first um, environmental services oversight began.
So you went from repairing equipment to overseeing the EVS department.
And maintenance and the construction underway. So we were basically clerk of the works on millions of dollars of construction as well. I was
It's not that far of a leap, actually,
No,
especially when you're in a hospital and with your
the
upbringing.
hospitals were all facilities, either facilities and environment. So the housekeeping, maintenance, biomedical departments, construction were all under that broad heading.
Hmm.
At When I went to Clifton Springs as a vice or director of facilities there, I had a broader scope, getting into what they called the central supply. Our notation was SPD, sterilization process and distribution, but that was also with security, um, and maintenance, construction. Um,
Sometimes even transport, like transportation is even lumped in a lot of
yes,
times in
so
healthcare.
we had a 30-acre campus, and
Mhm.
our snow removal, lawn care, everything was all
Yeah, everything.
part of that, and
So then how did you get from there to long-term care?
the local nursing home in Rochester was Wesley was recruiting for a vice president of facilities. I had the um, I had the credentials for it. They were coming off a major project, a 55-bed multi-story tower addition that had gone horribly wrong. So they needed somebody to come in and deal with the contractor and work out the $1 million of punch list items that still existed
Whole
after they were
millions of
already.
dollars of punch list?
Yes.
For those who don't know, after what a punch list is, after a construction job is done, normally there's like little tiny bits and pieces that are missed. Like a little piece of baseboard needs to be put in. You're missing a ceiling tile. A wall needs to be repainted. Like the punch list is generally a tiny thing, not $1 million thing. That doesn't sound like a punch list, Bob. That sounds like a whole
Well, it
redo.
was some of the top items that I recall. The one of the boilers of three did not work properly since it was installed. The
Oh,
underground fuel tank wasn't piped to the emergency generators. There was the tank
wow.
they were using was sitting on a pile of dirt, and the fuel oil piping ran across the resident patio down into the boiler room.
Wow.
So not tiny items. So
Yeah. Holy
we
moly.
were we were told by our our construction attorney that we were a 1 in 1,000 project, and we were this close to arbitration, going into arbitration, because we at one point I spent 2 days with the contractor and their subs in a local hotel, going over everything that they did wrong, didn't do, and it's kind of an interesting when some of the management at those subcontractors didn't realize what wasn't done. They weren't aware.
Yeah, that's not that far off. I mean, we have that even you can even have that in a small operation where if the person
Right,
who's doing the job is not communicating or the person overseeing is not looking,
right.
it's quite
The
easy to lose oversight.
the fuel oil tank that was 4,000 gallons of fuel was showing it was leaking for a year, as an example. So it was, and it wasn't connected to anything. So it was just a potential, underground storage tank leak. The the simple solution was that whoever installed the float device to sense the leak in the interstitial lining, the tank is double lined, put it in so it didn't open and report a leak. As it rolled around, it opened and reported a leak as it rolled around the circular lining. So it was a simple fix, but they didn't take care of it for a year,
Wow.
and they were unaware that why it leaked. It was the comedy of errors on the side. And the construction company I dealt with at the same company at Clifton Springs, where I'd worked previously, and we had stellar multiple $1 million projects with them and had no issue whatsoever.
Hmm.
So
I got into a fell down a rabbit hole once on YouTube. I'm prone to fall down YouTube rabbit holes, just so we're clear. But I fell down one on gas tanks, on underground gas storage tanks, and so I think I know a little more than I ever really should know about shut off valves and emergency leaking and all that stuff. So
yeah, there you go.
it's quite interesting because there's so many. There's kind of like you have the double liner tank, and then you have a default in case there's a leak, and then there's a default in case the default doesn't work. But like there's 3 or 4 different levels, and so just to imagine that it's not working for a year, you generally wouldn't
You would think
think that's possible.
somebody would have took note of that and thought that might have been a priority.
I know, just the sound of the alarm. No, there's no alarm.
I think the alarm actually rang so long it failed.
Oh, the alarm failed. Yeah, that's good. That's good. So then you go from being the facilities director. How do you become an administrator? Who said,
Once
"Hey, you
I
should be an administrator,
arrived in
Bob"?
and both hospitals had long-term cares attached,
Hmm.
so I was not unfamiliar with the DOH survey process and that type, that type operation. Um, when I came to the facility and said, it took me less than a year. Said, I think I want to be I think I want to be an administrator. There I see potential growth here. Um, I applied to New York State for the licensure. Had to take, I think, three courses at a local college. Well, actually, St. Joseph's College of Maine at the time. So I did it distance learning. A couple of my courses were waived because there were five at the time that were required. A couple were waived because of my prior experience, and they waived my 100 hour course. So I basically tested, passed, and became an administrator without having to do an AIT, having to do a hundred
Wow.
hour course or any of that that most administrators have to fight through.
I have a friend. She's been an administrator for a long time now, but hearing how she became an AIT, she had to, because you have to have 100 hours. Maybe it's even a little more than that at this point. I'm not sure, but
Yeah.
she she worked full time as a business office manager in a nursing home, and
Hmm.
then would volunteer 3 nights a week at another nursing home so that she could get her hours in, so that she could take the test to become the administrator. Like, that's,
Yep.
that person really wanted to be an administrator. That's a lot of work. That's a
They did.
and just to hear that you didn't have to go through the AIT nowadays. AITs are not paid. There's still that whole thing where you're expected to do it without getting a paycheck and all that stuff. It's a tough racket. It's a
Yep.
tough racket.
And I
Hmm.
had two AITs that worked for me. Once I became an administrator, once I became president and CEO. But my predecessor, I'll give him the credit for knowing how to go through the system and eliminate the AIT portion. Because
Mm.
basically, while I was going through my coursework, I was growing my experience to eliminate the AIT. So he was progressively giving me more responsibility as I went through my administrative coursework. So when I came to the point of testing and finishing the coursework, I had already prior and more recent experience that took care of the AIT requirement.
And truth be told, you wouldn't have been able to pass that test had you not had that, either one of the two, right? That either
Correct.
hands-on
Correct.
experience or an AIT program.
Yeah. Because
Yeah.
to give you an idea, my scope at Clifton Springs Hospital before I came to Wesley was 120 FTEs. So it was massive numbers, multiple departments. So it wasn't um, it wasn't necessarily on the clinical side, but my biomedical engineering technology brought some of that clinical in as well. So I knew a lot more than most quote unquote maintenance guys that came in.
So now you're the administrator, CEO, president. What was the first department that you did outsource? Did you ever outsource rehab or business office? Or business office is the
We actually outsourced both of those after the housekeeping
Oh, so
side
those
of it.
were so housekeeping was first.
Yes, housekeeping
Wow.
was my toe in the water, so to speak. So, and that was we had almost coincidentally, we had the retirement of an assistant administrator at the time, who was our HR director, but had a lot of hospital experience. He worked at Clifton when I was there. Kind of oversaw the operational departments. Um, I at the time I was running. I was the administrator and the president and CEO. So I was stretched thin. The board was pushing me to more of a strategic position and less of an operation. So it was how are we, what departments can we shed to a contract in the um, least impact to the facility, maybe shave some dollars in the process, and see how that goes.
I'm curious. I'm curious how, if you were to like just say a percentage wise, how important was saving money? Was it a 50-50? Was
Uh,
money a motivator at all? It doesn't sound like money was the motivator.
it was probably, I'd say 50-50, because you're in the nursing home side, you're always looking at star rankings, customer satisfaction, etc. A dirty facility, dirty floors. When I don't know, may not be most people, but you see dirty baseboards and dusted edges and that type thing, and it's your first impression of the facility walking through the parking lot, let alone your main lobby. And if your main lobby bathrooms are grungy, that's your first impression to the families of what kind of care you're giving.
Yeah, and to your point, even the parking lot, the glass on the sliding glass window, the sliding glass door when you're walking in, the carpet, the front lap, everything is just
Yes,
impression, impression, impression before you ever meet and say hello to anybody.
right.
So I would argue that housekeeping is the most important, my opinion,
I,
of course.
I'll give you a high percentage. It's
What came first,
definitely one of
housekeeping or the
the first
building?
impressions.
So I like that there was this part where you got to kind of make a decision. And I may have even used the line on you because it's a line that I really believe in, and that is you got to make a decision at some point. Are you in the healthcare business or the cleaning business? Are you in the healthcare business or the food service business? What
Sure.
if you had to focus on one thing? In my opinion, quality outcomes, quality measures,
Right,
medical, healthcare quality measures are probably more important to you than clean baseboards.
right. And
Not
that
that clean
was
baseboards aren't important.
and I think you did use that line and it resonated because at the time, well, early on in my experience, we had shed an adult home, we shed independent housing. Leslie was focused on nursing home care only.
There
We
you go.
didn't want to get into the multifaceted assisted living, independent living, and all that other that others were doing, home cares and everything else, adult day health care, and there some facilities have a whole gamut.
Of course. And they're all good business models. You just got to choose what you want to be in.
Right. So we had already chosen we want to be only in the nursing home business.
Got it.
And that was part of the problem is with some staff turnover, longevity. The environmental service department was no longer that elder workforce that we had previously. That some of the motivation. They've been here for a lot of years. We had multiple people retire in short order, including the supervisor, and then it, it had the same type facility setup. So the person that was in the maintenance manager essentially was overseeing the housekeeping supervisor. And as we've seen 1,000 times in any of the businesses, those folks go back to their core. They he'd rather plunge, maybe not, but he might not want to plunge a toilet before he does housekeeping management or training the supervisor. But I'd say it's a pretty close call.
I've always appreciated maintenance personnel, but I've never met a maintenance person who would rather, worry about clean rooms and baseboards and plug toilets. If you give them one option to look at a boiler, they're looking at that boiler, whether they're looking at nothing or not.
Yeah. I will say from experience, look at their maintenance shop, and that'll give you an idea how their housekeeping skills are.
I think you almost just took the carpet out from underneath at least most maintenance shops I've ever seen.
Exactly.
Disorganized at the very least. So you decide to outsource because you met this amazing salesman. And how did it go? Was it? It's funny too that you're saying that you're going through a lot of staffing turnover, because I mean, don't you ever? What's so fun and interesting to me is the Americans. What is that act with the Age Discrimination Act? The Age Discrimination Act.
Oh,
Remember the Age Discrimination Act? Yeah, the that came out in the mid 70s, and it was against companies. You couldn't discriminate against people's age, but it doesn't kick in until you're 40. And it was because in response to like all these companies were, laying off these 40-year-old workers to hire these 22-year-old college students. And nowadays, I'd give anything for a 40-year-old worker.
Exactly. That's exactly right.
It's just, where we've come, right? It's just like this full circle. But when you lose that older workforce, they're all retiring and they're getting out of it, and now all of a sudden people aren't even showing up, and you're having. You tell me if I'm wrong on this, but it seems like you go from having small issues with clean and dirty. You're dealing with facility issues, room changes, plug toilets, dirty cubicle curtains, that kind of thing, and all of a sudden it changes, and now you're focusing on, did they show up? Did they show up on time? What do you mean she left already? Right? Like it's a whole nother you're not even talking about cleaning anymore. You're just trying to get people to come in the door on time.
Even why, as a housekeeping supervisor, aren't you hiring people? They had, we went through a period where they were either looking for a friend or the perfect worker rather than having to train anybody. So they were going through all kinds of applications, but not hiring anybody.
Yeah.
And in the meantime, you have open positions and paid time off and sick and everything else that creates those, creates even more of a magnification on that open position.
Yeah, I agree. And once again, to highlight that a EVS director, a standalone EVS director by themselves, they've got to be, if they're expected to stand on their own 2 feet, they've got to be really good at hiring, interviewing, training, finding, researching. And most of us aren't good at all those things. That's why we have HR, right? That's why we have support services, just to support all the departments.
Right.
So what was it like when you handed that off to an outsourced company? You're like, and now it's your problem.
And initially I was, hey, somebody else's problem. Now we did only hand off the management function. The employees.
Why did you do that? Why did you go management only instead of management and staff?
One reason was that we continue to have 1199 SEIU as a union workforce for the housekeeping department.
Did you have a language in the contract that says you couldn't use an outside management contract or a management company?
We had to. The language said that we had to approach the union about outsourcing before we did anything. So we kind of had to. We would have had to kind of negotiate how that was going to happen.
Okay.
And it was, as I was, as I say, dipping my toe in the water, I thought, okay, this would be the segue to start the management side, and then we could turn the employees over, because that same, salesman was saying in his higher ups were saying, oh, we can have a Me Too agreement. We've done this with other contract, other unions. Shouldn't be, would be seamless. However, whatever that contract was, it was just kind of a pass pass through anyway. So
Yeah, there's no cost benefit to it.
correct.
Yeah.
So, I thought would see what the financial resources, training resources that the contract company would bring into the management side, because that, to me, that seemed to be our weakest link of oversight of the employees, training of the employees, keeping them engaged, and thought who better than a company that does it for a lot of others.
Yeah, and that only does it. There's
Yeah,
something really special about finding a specialized company. You
right,
don't go to the hospital because they have the best food. Not that they don't have good food, but that's not why you're there,
right.
right?
And what I then found out was we had the same issues with that management turnover as the company had somebody that worked well in our facility. They were putting them front line in another facility, so, or sending a trainee in conjunction for a small period of time, but then we were left with the trainee, and the new person, or the person that was knowledgeable, went on. So we had, in several years, probably had several management um, types in under the contract. Actually, more than several. So several that I can recall.
So what you were hoping for was to be able to hand it off and just go, all right, I've got the housekeeping and laundry department taken care of. I've hired an expert company. And then in very short order, you're dealing with the same issues as if you would have kept it yourself.
Right.
And then
I'm taking pictures of the cleanliness issues that I see. I am seeing the overtime creep up because they're not managing the overtime. All the things that I thought I wouldn't have to be micromanaging or spending my time on was back to spending my time, and then spending my time multiple times because the same issue was recurring with the multiple managers that came in under the contract. So when I dealt with the overtime issue and what they needed to do and how they needed staff, and some of those, really basic issues, um, the, I was back to that 6 months later with another person doing the same thing, and so I hate to jump over anyone's head, but I found myself emailing the higher ups at the company more often about the same issue and say, look, we dealt with this, had this under control, now it's back again. And I can't spend my, as a straddling president and CEO and administrator, I can't spend my time looking at housekeeping issues and dirt in the elevator tracks.
how was the whole idea of outsourcing received by your other department heads? Like, did anybody start getting nervous? And was there did you announce it to your team and say, hey, listen, we're going to outsource the housekeeping and laundry management of it? Was it received well, not well?
We did. Obviously, there are some managers that are nervous all the time. Our dietary director, for one, because that company also did dietary. The company also did maintenance. Um, less of that, I think, than from my impression. But so obviously our dietary director was a nervous type, and she was nervous. We did look into that a little bit. I found it was helpful just to scratch the surface, because that woke her up a little bit to what
There's nothing like a swift kick in the butt, right?
woke her up to what others were looking at and where she might improve on her operation. And and when you start to go down that rabbit hole, you may also lose that person if they decide to jump. She had been there a lot of years. Um, we she ran a tight ship, so I was on one way I was afraid to lose her, but um, she'd been there so many years, she was kind of fixed in her ways, and needed some outside perspective, and I found that was one way that we could bring that into the dining side or the maintenance side, is as soon as somebody else comes in and starts looking and they start asking questions, and people, same old doesn't necessarily carry on once you have somebody else questioning what you're doing.
When it doesn't take long, it seems like it didn't take very long for after you outsourced it to find that you were kind of in the same boat as you were before, especially with clean and dirty issues. If you were taking pictures of everything, how was that received by your other management team? Were they too pointing things out? Were they too, all of a sudden, could you even differentiate? Were they more critical of the now that you outsourced than they were before?
Some that were intimately involved with the environmental services side, um, the admission preps, the turnover of rooms, housekeeping can drag that out, and
Yeah.
so
Anybody
admission
involved in that process, if you mess
and
one part up, yeah.
yes, and admission. So admissions was very vocal, um, because they're going to bring someone to a room, and admissions started going to the room that was prepped to verify that it was prepped, because they've had egg on their face before, where someone's socks are still in the drawer, or
Hmm.
there's feces on the toilet, or something, any of those items that again, that first impression, you're
Yeah, of course.
you're shooting yourself in the foot.
Did you ever cancel the contract?
No, I think the after I retired, we we were at a point for probably the last 2 years of my employment where the facility was being sold.
Ah,
So kind of everything was kind of static. And it was the CFO retired. We did contract before that sale came up. We did contract out the business office side. We had
business
looked at
office is the number one most outsourced department in long-term care.
certainly downstated. There's some
Yep.
big business office groups. And we did it actually two ways. We first formed a group. We first formed a company with two other not for profits, so we could house a business office within our own ownership, if you will. So even though they were other not for profits, we still had a 1/3 stake in a business office, and then we didn't have to hire a CFO for ourselves.
You could
We
split
could
it.
have a
Yeah.
deeper pool in the business office. Actually, did get into maintenance management in that business office side. It was an offshoot that we hired a facilities director for all three,
Oh,
uh,
okay.
and not for housekeeping oversight, but more for the maintenance, construction, just keeping bringing a little bit more expertise to the table than any of us could hire on our own. And it kind of focused that higher end stuff with that person, as well as on the financial side as well. Um, and the problem we had was that the one CEO was retiring when we formed that, because the potential was that that organization grew to overall management. So my position would either be eliminated, or we might end up with one CEO ultimately
Yeah. Yeah.
in those three groups, because we're all paying CEO salaries, and that's a big number.
Hmm.
Do we really need, especially if I'm straddling for an administrator position, how much of that hourly salary, or salary, is being paid for an administrator type work versus a president and CEO?
Sure.
So
So in the end, though, you outsourced. You didn't do dietary. You did
well,
housekeeping management, facilities management, business office, and PT.
yep.
Right?
And the business office the side then went to an outside group after the consortium kind of fell apart. That period ended, and we went to an outside business office just
Okay.
for the sake of the transition to the new owners.
I guess my question is, if you could go back, would you have done it sooner or not done it at all?
On both of those counts, probably not done it at all. On the housekeeping side or the business office side, it there there were and it may
It's
have
not
been the
the answer I was hoping for, Bob.
well, there is a fourth option that we didn't talk that I wasn't aware of too.
Yeah.
So, there's another a gentleman that approached me about a consulting agreement that after the fact for housekeeping
We're
service.
we're all growing, Bob. We're all growing. We're all just trying to figure it out here.
Yes, and part of the way we brought that group together was that rather than an outside CFO was brought in, but the controller was from one of the organizations. That controller ended up keeping his payables person and all of the people from that particular organization because of the lack of computer expertise they had, software at that particular organization. They continue to be housed there. So rather than being an independent location, they became more. The other two were, redheaded stepchildren, if you
Sure.
will, versus what they needed to do.
Yeah, but that consortium that you kind of created with these other two nursing homes, so that the three of you were kind of trying to do some economies of scale with the CFO, with your facilities director, all that kind of stuff. That aside, let's just go back to the actual outsourcing of housekeeping, business office when you finally did that, and rehab. You wouldn't have done any of those.
Rehab, I would have done.
Yeah,
The in that we had a very steady rehab business for many years, but in the year or two before our conversion to contract, it became very variable, and the contract companies for rehab typically bill on a per minute given. So rather than a fixed salary and benefits of $1 million that we were paying to a rehab department, we were getting the rehab we needed, we were paying for the rehab we needed, getting the reimbursement we needed, and it followed the variability of the census.
so what rehab was able to do was take their expertise and really overlay what your needs were as a facility and be able to provide a really great service, which is what it sounds like housekeeping wasn't able to do.
Right, and also the whole rugs Medicare reimbursement for rehab was changing. So that the way we did billing previously, the way we made money previously, we knew was going to change. And who better than the experts in the rehabs that have been following this massive transition for a year or more
Mm-hmm.
to bring that expertise to the table initially, rather than somebody internally trying to figure it out and hope they get it right, because that rehab revenue for us offset the loss we had on Medicare, or excuse me, Medicaid. Medicaid was a loser, and the Medicare offset on the revenue side to keep us to that break even operation we were looking for.
On, I think this is going to be a really great question, because what I want to know is, how can a outside contract housekeeping company, how could they have been better? And the reason why I think it's such a good question for you is because you come from the facility side, and even though you came in after. Who'd you say was doing it for the hospital? Would you say
I came in after Service Master was
Service Master? Right. So
and they
Service
were, they
Master.
were and they were at Wesley. So
Oh, they were. Well,
yes,
the reason I bring that up is because a lot of times what happens when a contract service leaves, especially when they leave, like if you come right after them, there's this whole memory thing that takes place, meaning all the staff still remember how they were told how to clean. They still remember the policies and procedures. They're still following, even though that company's no longer there, they're still following that company, right?
right,
Or that company's policies and procedures and cleaning methodologies and all that stuff. So there's some lasting benefits,
Yeah.
especially if you don't have a lot of turnover in that staffing. So were you able to build upon that? Like, how is that how you kind of got your own feet wet? And
I think the staff had been there. They hadn't been entrenched in Service Master for, I want to say, 3 or 5 years. So they really weren't
oh,
a
so it was a
forever
while then.
type,
Okay.
forever type organization. It was kind of a we're gonna try this, and I think they realized it wasn't working out. Um, and the staff, that staff did have that muscle memory, if you will, and that there wasn't a lot of turnover for many
Mm-hmm.
years in our environmental services department. It was probably one of the highest longevities, including dining, in the building for retention and years of service. And um, every year, I mean, we had a cook in dining that was 40 plus years, and
Wow.
and some 30 plus year environmental services people. So they've been around. They knew what to do, what not to do, and kind of learn from that. Um, it was there. You would think that there were policy and procedure manuals and things was with Service Master, but that didn't really exist. So we were building policy and procedure manuals. It might have existed, but they took it with them, and nobody bothered to keep a copy.
Got it. Got it. Yeah. Dead of the night, sneak out of there.
Yeah,
So how do you have any ideas? Like, how could a commercial cleaning business be successful in long-term care?
I I think if they um, build that, well, first of all, building the relationship with the rest of the team is key, and having a supervisor manager that that is engaged with the rest of with that front line in the department and the rest of the departments. Um, they they need to hear what the needs are of the rest of the frontline staff, clinical admissions, etc., and kind of use that in their focus rather than just listening to what the front office tells them as far as financials, or I'm putting in my time. So I come in at 7, I leave at 2ish. My boss isn't around. We had some of that.
2-ish. I like 2-ish. That's really great. I had a friend reach out a couple days ago, and I do a lot of management coaching, as you know. And I had a friend reach out and want me to help him walk through. He was going to let somebody go, let a new manager go, and a new housekeeping manager. And he's explaining like all the things that are going wrong. I said, well, how long has she been there? And he hesitates. He goes, well, maybe 6 weeks. I go, weeks? I was expecting years, months at the very weeks, 4 to 6 weeks. And the more he kept talking, the more I realized what the underlying problem could have been. I don't know because I'm not there, but just this whole idea that you have a brand new housekeeper manager coming in. And so here are some of the signs that you were saying. Like she wasn't being found. People couldn't find her when they needed her. She wasn't returning emails, and she wasn't answering her phone. And what that told me, and again, I just helped him go through the termination process because who am I? I mean, he's already made the decision. But what I kind of thought about was, with all my experience working in long-term care, and how I think that the reason that she didn't walk a lot on the floors is because she wasn't confident. I think the reason why she doesn't answer emails or phone calls because she was always getting yelled at or questioned, right? Like, you know how easy it is to be an outcast of a management team. It's so hard. I not to talk about cliques, but I think cliques are important. I think management teams should be real tight and clicky, but if you're not part of that clique, if you don't have a way inside of that clique, if you're not being embraced by that management team, it can be very challenging. And to your point, when you have like you're the CEO and you're talking to another CEO and you're both trying to solve a problem like this, it doesn't work. Right. I mean, all you're doing is identifying the problem. He's like, oh, I'll take care of it. And like, with directives, we got to figure out how to get those management teams to work better, because I imagine if the facilities manager, the housekeeping manager, the maintenance manager, the RN, the DON, if they're all working well together, they all have each other's cell phone numbers. They're all having lunch together. I mean, I'm not telling you anything that you already haven't heard me talk about at nauseum, but I think that's how you create a winning team.
And you get those CEOs that swoop in for 20 minutes because they don't only have the time to devote to that. Okay, it's solved. And in 6 months, you come back and it's like, what are you doing? We talked about this 6 months ago.
Yeah, it's not even 6 months. It's 6 weeks ago, 6 days ago.
When you, one of the biggest frustrations for me in my entire career was solving the same problem 5 or 6 times as different people came through. It's like we dealt with this with the last CFO. Why are we dealing with it with the new CFO?
Yeah, exactly. One other thing that I'd like to bring back up is the whole idea of not owning the staff. And you talked about how overtime started to creep and a Me Too agreement. For those who don't know what a Me Too agreement is, it just simply means when a company has a contract with a union, it's impossible to get that contract to be changed in any way. So a subcontractor would come in and just sign a Me Too, like whatever you agreed to, we'll agree to as well, right? And so while I agree with you, it's always a pass-through as far as the cost goes. If there's a benefit need to be paid out, a uniform allowance need to be paid out, whatever, it's just going to be pass-through because you'd already be paying for it anyway. The real challenge with not having ownership of the staff is, I remember, as like a little brief thing, I dated a woman once who had little kids, and they would always say, "You're not my dad." Like, I wasn't trying to be your dad. I just didn't want you to stick your finger in the light socket. But because, you know what I mean? And that's the mentality when you don't own the staff.
Right.
And it gets worse than that because then the company who's managing your staff doesn't have any liability with the overtime. And so, that's the problem with government. All government employees, they don't understand the concept of money because it's not their money. It's the same kind of attitude, right? Like, oh, well, I mean, it's their overtime, not my overtime.
To flip that, one of the issues that we had was we were very big on discipline. We were, because of the union contract, the step disciplinary process, we lived with that. We used that and terminated a number of poor performing people or poor customer service, you name it, in all sorts of departments. What we found in having the employees under us but not under the contract is the contract management became hesitant at disciplining and terminating anybody because it just created more work for them to train, to discipline, to everything else. They had this fear that we were, they were going to be sued or something, and it was very frustrating when you have that at your in your set of tools, and they're not using it.
Yeah,
they're not moving people through. That you're finding people. I would stop in a men's locker room and non-break time, 3 or 4 housekeepers would be in there. It was their break room. They actually would drag the lazy boy chairs and
oh my gosh
into the men's locker room, and it was, and if you think about it, on the evening shifts when you have a female nursing supervisor, there's no way that she's going into the men's locker room.
I remember I was working I'd been asked to go do a consultant work with this company, and I went and walked in the maintenance break room, and it was probably 10 o'clock in the morning, and the 3 maintenance guys were watching TV on a huge plasma flat screen TV on the wall. I was like, "Oh, hi." They're like, "Hi." Go, "Who brought the TV?" Like, "No, somebody left it." Like, they're using a resident's TV. Like, all right, you can't make that up. Anyway.
I'll never forget one of my first rounds that we used to do weekend rounds for the executive team when I came into Wesley, and I walked into a dining room on one of the floors, and it was a Sunday afternoon, football game's on, and a couple housekeepers and clinical staff are in there, CNAs are in there watching, watching the game.
Is that wrong?
And I walked up and who's playing? You know, it's like, who are you? Well, I have a badge. They scattered quickly.
Yeah, no question. So
that's why I always went up the back stairway to the 7th floor, and by the time you got to the 5th floor, everybody knew you were in the building. So,
yeah, they're all running ahead of you. Yeah.
Yes.
Bob is here. Bob is here. I spent a couple of years as a consultant, housekeeping, laundry, dietary, facility maintenance consultant, where I would go into nursing homes. They'd hire me. I'd come in and rewrite all their job routines. I would create all their workflows. I put all their schedules together. And then I would leave. I would literally just set it all up for them. And then I would leave. And I'd follow back up in a few months. And of course, not a single thing had changed. Not one thing had been implemented. Nobody had followed a single, job routine at all. And so then I started to offer this other service where I would then oversee it, right? Because it's one thing to write the job routines and do all that. Let me just add this extra side to it where I'll oversee it. I'll come into the building once a week, once a month, whatever it is, whatever the contract terms are, just to make sure it's happening. I can do some ongoing training and management development, all that stuff. And I got to tell you, Bob, it was a nightmare. And the reason it was a nightmare is because I didn't own anything. None of the staff officially worked for me. The management didn't work for me. The administrator certainly didn't work for me. And so I would say, hey, this is the routine we're going with that I created with the owner's help. And the administrator would be like, the owner schmoner, right? Like, it doesn't matter. I'm going to do it my own way. And it was real. So from there is when I started to created the Standard Health and Rehab, where I started to just do the education piece, which you attended one of my workshops where I started. What are you looking for?
I have a certificate here somewhere.
Oh yeah, you're damn right you do. That's what we do here. So that's how I started doing the education side instead of the in-person side. Because unless I have the ability, and I learned this along the way, even with your contract, if you're not giving me the staff, then I'm simply not going to have the ability to manage anybody, because nobody has to listen to me for any reason. It's much better. You got to do either one or the other. Own it all, or don't own any of it, and just be the education side.
And if you had the backing, that top down, the owner schmoner, from the administrator's perspective, that was in my organization, that would have been the end of an administrator. I can recall we brought in United Healthcare Optum, it's now called Optum, and a social work director told me that she didn't think she should be selling insurance. Well, they don't sell insurance. It was just her way of trying to skate around it. Well, that was the end of her tenure at Wesley. Was we no longer need you. And I think that sent a clear message to the organization that
yeah,
you're going to buy in or you're going to get on a boat and
yeah, it is.
What's the old adage? The boat's leaving the dock. You're either in the boat, or we're going to leave you behind.
I think I've always, it's one of the things I really have always appreciated about you and Wesley and all the management team there is everybody really did understand that you were either for Wesley or against Wesley, and you're either going to be on the boat or not on the boat. But I got to tell you, there's a lot of administrators out there. I met an administrator once where I was talking about we're having a big problem with nursing, with gloves on the floor and nobody picking up after themselves. And the administrator said, and I swear I'm not making this up. She said, we tell our CNAs but it's one of the selling points when we hire them, is we tell them they don't have to pick up after themselves. I swear, this guy is a licensed long-term care administrator in upstate New York right this second, tells his CNAs when they come in, hey, listen, you don't ever have to pick up after yourself. That's why we have housekeepers. I mean, it's the most insane, ludicrous kind of message. But how far do you think I was able to get with his team? Nowhere. I couldn't train anybody. I couldn't hold anybody accountable. I couldn't ask anybody to do anything over and above, or even just what they were supposed to be doing.
And how demoralizing to the housekeeping staff that
oh my gosh, yeah,
up after the staff, not the residents. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. There's a lot of administrators out there who think that housekeeping should, I think in order to clean up after some, I mean, you need to have a housekeeper assigned to each CNA, like each CNA should have their own assistant, like assistant housekeeper. It gets a little crazy out there.
We actually considered splitting up housekeeping and giving it to each nurse manager on a floor. So they had their own housekeeper, their own, part-time housekeeper that did their floor. So there was more of an ownership that way.
It's a good idea.
One thing we found with turnover and training and open positions, there wasn't, when you lose that ownership of this is my floor, or the part-timer that typically comes in, well, I only have to do so much because it's not my floor, and I don't have to work too hard because this person's really getting the responsibility for the other person's getting the responsibility for the cleanliness of that floor.
I would say that other than project work, and I'm going to say this knowing that I make my money in housekeeping, in long-term care, right? I mean, in senior care centers. There's been I can't think of a single nursing home I've ever been in that needed housekeeping. You don't need housekeeping. I mean, it's such a, talk about a waste of resources, because 80% of what housekeeping does is pick up after other staff. If you just had other staff pick up after themselves, I mean, you could quite literally manage, you could get away with, how big was Wesley? 200 beds?
200 beds. Yeah.
200 beds. I bet you could do fine with Wesley if your staff was just picking up after themselves. You could do fine with Wesley with 2 or 3 housekeepers a day.
Although Wesley was on the we'll call it the bleeding edge of the universal worker, the Eden environment type. Mm-hmm. Many hands make light work was one of the things that I came into. They thought they could reduce housekeeping and turn it over to the CNAs, and we heard one CNA say, I didn't go to my training to be a housekeeper. Nobody wants to do housekeeping, and that's seen as a
Agreed. But just to be clear, I'm not talking about cleaning. I'm not saying CNA should be cleaning toilets. I'm not saying they should be cleaning sinks. I'm not saying they should be wiping down beds. I'm not suggesting any of that.
Yep.
I'm suggesting that if CNAs picked up after themselves, like you wouldn't find debris on the ground. Briefs weren't in the trash in resident rooms, right? Dirty briefs weren't left in the trash.
Oh, sorry.
No, I'm just saying you wouldn't need housekeeping.
The evolution of the Eden environment and some of the facilities falling on their face, getting rid of housekeeping and then bringing them back because they can't get the staff. The staff won't be clean on their own.
I always wonder in banking, the hours are, the bank's open from 9 to 5, which means the hours are from like 8:30 to 5:30. That's the hours of an employee. And you never hire a part-time employee as far as they're only going to work a couple of hours today. You hire full-time. Everybody in a bank is full-time. Everybody. And so then what happens if you go into the bank on some random slow day, like a Tuesday or a Wednesday, you'll see a lot of people with nothing to do because they're full-time employees, and you're not going to let people leave or not schedule them because they're full-time. Everybody has to get their hours. And I think that attitude kind of permeates. And so like the grocery cart in the parking lot is a perfect example. And you ask people like, why don't you put your grocery cart away? They go, well, it's job security for whoever picks up grocery carts, without understanding the whole purpose of a grocery cart picker upper is because people first wouldn't put away their own grocery cart, right? Like people are.
And if you go to the bank after hours to use the ATM, you see the contract cleaning service in there.
And they could have been cleaning all day, right? I mean, the staff could easily run a rag. And again, I'm in commercial cleaning, so I'm not against, I'm not trying to give away the contract. I'm just simply saying that a lot of times people are actually, have this attitude that the reason I'm not picking up after myself, the reason I'm not putting the carts away is because it's job security for somebody else. And all right, it's one way to look at it, but it can be a real challenge, especially when we agreed in the beginning. If the facility looks bad, I don't care how good your nursing is. I don't care what your quality measure numbers are. If it looks bad, it probably is bad. That's the perception.
Right.
This has been fun, Bob.
It's always a joy talking with you, Ralph. Even if others are listening.
Well, I'm the same either way. You could. How are you in real life? This is me in real life.
And you've known me long enough that this is me.
No question. And so that, let's just, I know I want to let you go here. I just want to touch on the fourth option, and that is consulting, which is what I'm doing now. You would have gone that route?
Definitely. It was, and even though the ownership wasn't there, as long as I was bought in, the staff knew that I bought in. As long as we would enforce that and the consultant would be, an integral part of the team, I don't see why it wouldn't have worked better than what we had. I was stunned because, you brought a lot of experience to the table before, but it took you less than 5 minutes on the back of a napkin to calculate what our FTE count should be and everything else, and how long it takes to clean a room, etc. And I had, I don't know how many housekeeping supervisor managers through the building that couldn't do that. Budget, and that was another issue with just trying to budget and get, when I'm having to help the housekeeping contract budget, same thing.
Insult to injury right there.
And what's worse is I'm telling him he needs more. and fighting the number up rather than what they told me in the first place. And because we work with vacancy factor, and if you have a high turnover and you have 2-3 months before a position is back in action, and you have a lot of longevity with high PTO accrual numbers, you can have, in our facility, we had sometimes 2 FTEs in just that vacancy factor in the housekeeping department. With just knowing that we're going to cover X number of vacations and X number of open positions and that period of time.
Yeah, I agree. I think that I certainly found, for me, what works the best is with the education piece, is with the consulting piece. It is just like, let's just take out a napkin and draw job routines. I can, do it in 8 seconds, but only because I've been doing it for, 20 years. It's not because I'm some genius. Good Lord. God knows.
Would like to think you are.
Well, there are times I have my moments. I'm like, look how smart I am. And then I'll run into a wall because I'm a moron, But we're going to get out of here, Bob. Thank you so much for coming on and talking about why people outsource and why they don't outsource, and maybe some of the pros and cons. And I appreciate you being so candid with me.
I appreciate the time. It's always a pleasure.
Yeah, don't go anywhere. But that's it for us, Mr. Bob Jones. And I thank you guys so much for paying attention and tuning in. By the way, I am, for those nursing home administrators who may be listening, I am hosting another workshop next week, Wednesday, Thursday, which Bob can tell you is pretty great. If nothing else, right? You get a nice certificate. 2 days, all on housekeeping and laundry operations. It gets 15 CEUs through the NAB. End of the year, you need those CEUs. So send me an email at ralph@ralphpeterson.com if you're interested in attending that workshop. Otherwise, that's it for us, the Housekeepers Podcast, the cleanest hour in podcasting. Thank you so much for joining us today, Mr. Bob Jones and me, Ralph Peterson.